A racist son humiliates his black father over a cheap birthday gift in front of everyone, only to discover a shocking truth about his father's painful past, with racism and sacrifice, that changes their relationship forever. The warm glow of birthday candles flickered across the faces gathered around the dining table. The room was filled with soft laughter and the clinking of plates. But beneath the surface, tension quietly simmered. Darius, a tall and broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, sat at the head of the table, his humble smile lighting up the modest celebration. It was his birthday, and his family had come together to honor him. Seated to his right was his teenage son, Jason. At 17, Jason had developed a brash confidence that sometimes teetered into arrogance. Recently, he had begun to resent his father's way of life. The simplicity, the sacrifices, the quiet dignity. Jason was impatient, striving for a life of status and material success, and in his youthful naivety, he blamed his father for their modest circumstances. The air buzzed with anticipation as Darius reached for the small box in front of him, wrapped neatly in plain paper. The gift had come from his son. Jason leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. "Go on, Dad," Jason said, his voice a touch too casual. "Open it." Darius chuckled softly and carefully peeled back the wrapping. Inside the box was a simple leather wallet, worn and clearly second-hand. Its edges were slightly frayed, and a faint scuff marked the front. Jason smirked, leaning forward. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The room fell silent. Darius's hand froze over the wallet, his warm smile faltering for just a moment before returning, albeit shakier. He looked up at his son, the light in his eyes dimming. "Thank you, Jason," he said, his voice soft, almost too soft. Jason laughed bitterly, breaking the awkward quiet. "You don't have to pretend to like it," he said, shrugging. "I mean, it's not like it's any worse than the stuff you've given me over the years, right?" A gasp escaped from Jason's younger sister, Mia, who sat wide-eyed across the table. Their mother, Clara, stiffened in her seat, her hand tightening around her glass. "Jason," she said sharply, "that's enough." But Jason wasn't done. "No, really," he said, gesturing toward the wallet. "Why would I spend my money on something nice when you've never done that for me? What's the point?" Darius's face fell, but he quickly masked it with a small nod, as if trying to absorb the blow quietly. He carefully placed the wallet back in the box and slid it aside. "It's the thought that counts, son," he said softly, though his voice trembled slightly. The table remained silent, the festive atmosphere all but shattered. Clara's jaw clenched as she looked at her husband, pain flashing in her eyes. Mia excused herself from the table, blinking back tears as she rushed to her room. Jason, still oblivious to the weight of his words, leaned back in his chair with a triumphant smirk. "Well, I guess that's dinner," he said, pushing his plate away. Darius stood quietly, his movements deliberate and slow, as though trying to maintain some semblance of composure. He began gathering plates, his hands trembling slightly. Clara reached out, touching his arm gently, but he shook his head with a faint smile, as if to assure her he was fine. As Jason got up to leave the table, Clara shot him a look that could cut steel. "Jason," she said, her voice low and steady, "you've said enough for tonight." Jason hesitated, the weight of her words giving him pause, but only for a moment. With a shrug, he walked out of the room, leaving behind the heavy silence of a birthday celebration turned sour. In the kitchen, Darius washed dishes in silence, the sound of running water filling the space. Clara joined him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "He doesn't mean it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Darius nodded, his back still turned to her. "I know," he said quietly. "He's young. He doesn't understand yet." Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve better, Darius. He'll see that one day." But as Darius stood there, staring at the soapy water, a single tear escaped, tracing a path down his cheek. He had sacrificed so much for his family, and tonight, those sacrifices felt heavier than ever. Jason sat on the edge of his bed, the photograph in his hands. The image was faded and slightly bent at the edges, a snapshot of a time long before Jason was born. In the picture, his father, Darius, stood tall but visibly leaner, wearing a plain white shirt and jeans that looked well worn. He was in front of a small weathered grocery store with peeling paint and a cracked sign that read, "Henry's Market." Behind Darius in the photo stood an older man, his own father, Jason's grandfather, whose face Jason barely recognized. The two men wore matching expressions of quiet determination, their arms laden with crates of produce. Jason had seen this photo before, but had never given it much thought. Night, though, something about it gripped him. Maybe it was the tense silence lingering after his outburst, or maybe it was the unfamiliar glint of hurt in his father's eyes that he couldn't ignore. For the first time, Jason wondered what that picture really meant. Curiosity nudged him forward, and he flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in his grandfather's shaky handwriting, were the words, "The first day of the market, 1979. A dream built on sacrifice." Jason furrowed his brow. He vaguely remembered hearing about the market as a kid, a small family business in a predominantly white neighborhood, where his father and grandfather had worked tirelessly, but he had never asked for details. It wasn't something his father spoke of often, and Jason had never cared enough to dig deeper. Something inside him stirred, though, a pang of guilt he didn't want to acknowledge. He shoved the feeling down and tucked the photo into his pocket. Leaving his room, he wandered into the living room, where his mother sat folding laundry, her face still tight with the tension from earlier. "Mom," Jason began, his voice softer than usual. "Can I ask you something?" Clara looked up, her hands pausing mid-fold. "Depends on what it is," she said cautiously, her gaze searching his face. Jason hesitated, then pulled the photograph from his pocket and handed it to her. "What's the story behind this?" he asked. Clara took the picture, her expression softening as she studied it. "You've seen this before," she said gently, though there was a touch of surprise in her voice. "I have," Jason admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "But I never really paid attention. What's the deal with the store?" "Dad never talks about it." Clara sighed and set the laundry aside. "That store was everything to your grandfather and your father," she said. "Your grandpa, Henry, built it from nothing. He worked 2 jobs just to save enough to open it. Back then, being a black man running a business in that part of town wasn't easy. A lot of people didn't want them there." Jason blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" Clara gave him a knowing look. "What do you think? There were protests outside the store for weeks when they opened. People threw rocks through the windows. Some even tried to scare them into closing by leaving hateful notes. But your grandfather didn't back down, and neither did your father. Darius was just a teenager at the time, but he helped out every day after school." Jason's stomach twisted as he imagined his father, his age now, facing that kind of hostility. "Why didn't he ever tell me about this?" Clara smiled faintly. "Your dad doesn't like to dwell on those things. He's always believed in looking forward, not back. But that store taught him how to work hard, how to keep his head up, even when the world was against him. It's why he is the way he is today." Jason sat down across from her, his thoughts racing. "What happened to it? The store, I mean." Clara's face fell slightly. "Your grandfather passed away when your dad was 22. The market was struggling by then. Customers were hard to come by, and the neighborhood never fully accepted them. Your dad tried to keep it going, but after a few years, he had to let it go. It broke his heart, Jason. He never talks about it because it's too painful." Jason sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on him. His father, the man he had just mocked for being cheap, had built his life on sacrifices Jason couldn't even begin to comprehend. He looked back at the photograph in his mother's hands. The younger version of his father in the picture suddenly seemed more real, more human. Jason couldn't shake the image of a teenage Darius standing in front of that market, fighting battles Jason had never even known existed. Clara reached out, touching Jason's hand gently. "Your father's sacrifices didn't stop with that store," she said quietly. "He's given everything he's ever had for this family, even when it's hard, even when it goes unnoticed." Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight. He nodded, but he couldn't find the words to respond. The night was still, but Jason's mind was anything but. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his mother's words pressing on his chest like a boulder. He hadn't been able to forget the look in his father's eyes earlier that evening. Hurt, quiet, but dignified. His gaze drifted to the corner of his desk, where the leather wallet he had dismissed so easily now sat under the faint glow of his desk lamp. Something compelled him to pick it up, his hands trembling slightly as he turned it over in his palms. At first glance it was unremarkable. Worn leather, scuffed edges. But as Jason opened it, a glint of faint lettering caught his eye. On the inside, barely visible against the aged material, were the words, "For Henry, always keep moving forward." Jason's breath hitched. The name hit him like a freight train. Henry, his grandfather. He ran his fingers over the faint inscription, trying to make sense of it. Always keep moving forward. His heart sank as realization dawned. This wasn't just some second-hand wallet. It had belonged to his grandfather, passed down to his father. His thoughts spun wildly. All night, Jason had wrestled with guilt over his words, but now that guilt felt like a chasm he couldn't cross. He had mocked his father for giving him something that, in reality, was a piece of their family's history, something tied to a legacy of resilience and sacrifice he had never appreciated. Jason got up, clutching the wallet in his hand, and paced the room. Memories of his father's unwavering support came rushing back. The times Darius had stayed up late helping him with school projects, the nights he'd come home from long shifts at work, only to sit and listen to Jason's endless plans for the future. The mornings he'd slipped a few extra bills into Jason's wallet, even when Jason had rolled his eyes and told him not to bother. How had Jason been so blind? He sank into his chair, staring at the wallet again, his fingers tracing the inscription over and over. He couldn't stop picturing his father as a young man, standing outside Henry's market, facing down the hostility of a world that refused to see him as equal. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Jason as a boy, asking his father why he worked so hard at his job, even though it didn't pay much. Darius had smiled at him and said, "Because when you work hard, you build something that lasts. Even if it's just love, Jason, it lasts." Jason felt tears sting his eyes. He had spent so much time resenting his father for not giving him more, for their simple life. But now he understood. His father had been giving him everything all along. The hours passed, but Jason couldn't sleep. Just before dawn, he made his way quietly into the living room, where he found Darius sitting in his favorite chair, staring out the window with a cup of coffee in hand. Jason hesitated at the doorway, unsure how to start. The room was bathed in soft grey light, and for a moment, he thought about retreating back to his room. But then Darius turned, noticing him. "You're up early," Darius said gently, his voice calm but weary. Jason swallowed hard and stepped into the room. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, sitting down on the couch across from his father. Darius took a sip of his coffee and nodded, waiting. He was always waiting, Jason realized, for Jason to come to him when he was ready. Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out the wallet, holding it tightly before placing it on the coffee table between them. I didn't know," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly. Darius glanced at the wallet, his expression unreadable. Didn't know what? Jason shifted uncomfortably. That this belonged to Grandpa. That it meant something. I shouldn't have said what I did. For a long moment Darius didn't respond. He picked up the wallet, turning it over in his hands. A faint, sad smile crossed his face. "Your grandfather gave this to me when we closed the market," he said quietly. "He told me to keep moving forward, no matter what. That even when things didn't go the way we wanted, we could still build something worthwhile." Jason's chest tightened. "Dad, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." Darius raised a hand gently, cutting him off. "It's okay, Jason. You're young. You don't see the world the way I do. Not yet. But I hurt you," Jason said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to, but I did." Darius leaned forward, placing the wallet back on the table. He rested his hands on his knees and looked his son in the eye. "Jason, I've faced worse than words. I've been called names I wouldn't repeat, been told I didn't belong more times than I can count. But the hardest thing I've ever faced was knowing you might grow up without understanding where you come from. That's what hurts, son. Not your words, but the distance between us." Jason felt the tears he'd been holding back spill over. He wiped his face hastily, embarrassed. But Darius reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jason," Darius said softly. "I always have been. And I hope one day you'll see the things I've tried to show you. Not the things I can give you, but the things I want you to carry with you. Like this wallet. Like your grandfather's words." Jason nodded, his voice too thick with emotion to respond. The first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds as Darius stood, setting his empty coffee mug on the table. Jason watched him intently, still clutching the wallet. For a moment, Darius hesitated, the weight of what he was about to share clearly visible in his furrowed brow. "Get your shoes on," Darius said quietly. Jason blinked, confused. "Where are we going?" "To see something you need to understand," Darius replied. Jason hurried to grab his sneakers and followed his father to the car. The morning air was crisp and still, the neighborhood eerily quiet. They drove in silence for nearly an hour, winding through streets Jason barely recognized. Finally, Darius turned onto a narrow road, lined with overgrown bushes and aging storefronts, their signs faded and forgotten. He pulled the car into an empty lot and parked. "We're here," Darius said, his voice heavy with emotion. Jason stepped out of the car, looking around. The area felt abandoned, desolate. In front of them stood a crumbling building, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling from its facade. But Jason immediately recognized the shape of the sign above the door. Henry's Market. The once vivid letters were barely legible now, weathered by decades of neglect. Jason stared, his throat tight as he tried to reconcile this broken-down building with the vibrant photo he had seen the night before. "This is it?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Darius nodded. "This was our store. Your grandfather poured his soul into this place, and I did too. We built it together, brick by brick." Jason hesitated, then asked the question that had been gnawing at him since last night. "Why here? Why did Grandpa open a store in a place where people didn't want him?" Darius gave a small, sad laugh. "Because he believed in this community, even when it didn't believe in him. Back then, black families couldn't rely on grocery stores in certain neighborhoods. They didn't carry what we needed. Your grandfather wanted to change that. He wanted to give people a place where they felt welcome, where they felt seen." Jason swallowed hard, his heart sinking as he looked at the building again. "But people fought against it?" Darius's expression darkened, his voice turning somber. "They did, every day. They'd stand outside, yelling slurs, telling us to leave. Sometimes they'd break the windows at night. And there were people who didn't protest. But they didn't shop here either. Not because they didn't want to, but because they were afraid of what others would say if they did." Jason stared at the ground, shame prickling at the back of his neck. He could only imagine the toll that kind of hatred had taken on his father and grandfather. "Why didn't you leave?" Jason asked, his voice shaky. Darius turned to him, his eyes steady. "Because we knew what we were fighting for. This wasn't just a store, Jason. It was a symbol. Every loaf of bread we sold, every piece of fruit someone bought. It wasn't just business. It was proof that we belonged, that we weren't going to be pushed out." Jason felt a lump in his throat as he thought about the sacrifices his father and grandfather had made to keep the store alive. "What happened when Grandpa passed away?" Darius sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. "It got harder. Without him, it felt like the heart of the store was gone. I kept it going for as long as I could, but the protests never stopped. And with the bigger grocery chains moving in, we couldn't compete. I had to close the doors." Jason could hear the pain in his father's voice, the weight of a dream that had been torn away. "But you didn't let it break you," Jason said, his voice trembling. "You kept going." Darius turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, because that's what your grandfather taught me. To always keep moving forward. Jason looked back at the building, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just a decaying structure. It was a monument to resilience, to courage, to a fight that his father and grandfather had taken on so he could have a better future. Darius stepped closer to the building, running his hand along the faded bricks. "I used to think about reopening it," he said quietly. "But life moved on, and the world moved on too. The only thing I could do was take what your grandfather gave me and pass it on to you." Jason felt his chest tighten again. He looked at his father, seeing him not as the simple man he had always taken for granted, but as someone who had carried the weight of a legacy Jason had never even tried to understand. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jason said, his voice breaking, "for what I said, for not seeing everything you've done for us." Darius turned, his eyes softening. "You're starting to see it now," he said. "That's what matters." Jason pulled the wallet from his pocket and held it out to his father. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Darius shook his head. "No, son, it belongs to you now. And when the time is right, you'll pass it on to someone else. Just make sure they know what it means." Jason nodded, tears streaming down his face. He looked back at the market one last time, silently promising himself that he would honor the sacrifices his father and grandfather had made. The drive home was quiet, the weight of the morning lingering between them. Jason stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. Every turn in the road brought new questions, but more than anything it brought clarity about his father, his family, and the sacrifices he had never understood. As they pulled into the driveway, Jason turned to Darius. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this before?" Darius cut the engine and leaned back in his seat, his gaze distant. "Because I wanted you to live differently," he said after a pause. "I wanted you to have choices, to chase your dreams without carrying the weight of mine. But maybe I should have told you sooner. Maybe I was wrong to keep it from you." Jason shook his head. "No, I get it now. I feel like I didn't deserve to know until now." Darius gave him a small smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You deserve to know, Jason. You always have." They sat in silence for a moment before Darius spoke again. "There's one more thing I want to show you," he said quietly. Jason followed his father inside. Darius led him to the attic, a space Jason rarely ventured into. Dust motes floated in the dim light as Darius pulled open an old trunk. Inside were stacks of documents, faded photographs, and a few carefully preserved items from Henry's market. Among the papers was a weathered journal. Darius picked it up and handed it to Jason. "This was your grandfather's," he said softly. Jason opened it carefully, the scent of aged paper rising. The pages were filled with Henry's meticulous handwriting, recounting the early days of the market. Jason read entries about the struggle to secure the store's lease, the nights spent stocking shelves, and the quiet pride of serving their community despite the opposition. One entry caught Jason's eye. "Darius worked late tonight, even though he had school early in the morning. I can see the fire in him, the same fire I had when I started this. He doesn't know it yet, but he's the reason I fight so hard to keep this store alive. One day, he'll understand." Jason's throat tightened as he read the words. He looked up at his father, who was watching him with quiet patience. "He believed in you so much," Jason said, his voice trembling. Darius nodded. "He did. And everything I've done, Jason, has been because of what he taught me. To work hard, to stand tall, to build something, even when the world tries to tear it down." Jason closed the journal and handed it back. "I don't know if I could have done what you both did," he admitted. Darius smiled. "You could, Jason. You've got the same fire in you. You just need to figure out where to direct it." Over the next few days, Jason couldn't stop thinking about the market, the sacrifices his father had made, and the legacy of resilience he was now a part of. He began looking for ways to honor that legacy, not just to ease his guilt, but to show his father how much he had learned. Jason spent hours researching, combing through old city records and gathering photos of Henry's Market. He even reached out to a local historical society to learn more about the community's history. Finally, one evening, he approached Darius in the living room. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking, what if we rebuilt the market?" Darius looked up from his newspaper, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean we bring it back," Jason said, his words spilling out quickly. "Not just for us, but for the community. I've been reading about food deserts and how a lot of neighborhoods still don't have access to fresh groceries. We could open something like what you and Grandpa had, but bigger, better." Darius stared at his son, his expression a mixture of surprise and pride. "Jason, that's ambitious," he said cautiously. "You know it wouldn't be easy." Jason nodded. "I know, but I want to try. I want to do something that matters, something that lasts, just like Grandpa did." Darius smiled, his eyes glistening. "If that's what you want, I'll help you, every step of the way." Months later, the foundation for a new market stood in place. Jason and Darius worked side by side, pouring their time, energy and hearts into the project. The new store, named Henry's Market Reimagined, became more than just a business. It became a beacon of hope for the community. On opening day, the store buzzed with life as neighbors, friends, and even strangers gathered to celebrate. Jason stood beside his father, greeting customers with a mixture of pride and gratitude. As the day wound down, Jason handed Darius a small box. "Open it," he said, grinning. Inside was the same leather wallet, now restored and polished, with the inscription shining brightly. Darius looked at his son, his expression unreadable. "It's your turn to carry it again," Jason said softly. "You've earned it, Dad." Darius's hand tightened around the wallet, and for the first time in Jason's memory, his father pulled him into a tight embrace. "Thank you, son," Darius whispered. "You've made me proud in ways I can't even put into words." Jason smiled, tears brimming in his eyes. He finally understood the true meaning of sacrifice, resilience, and love, and for the first time, he felt worthy of carrying the legacy forward. As the sun set behind the new market, Jason and Darius stood outside, watching the last of the customers leave. The glow of the store's sign lit up their faces, a symbol of everything they had rebuilt together. And as Jason looked at his father, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one written with respect, understanding, and the strength of their shared history.